Right. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'll try to make it fun in one way or another. What I'm going to try and do is show that certain thematic connotations that became attached to circular or ring-like depictions of serpents, dragons, in the insular Germanic visual sphere are also evoked by circular or ring-like poetic structures in Beowulf. To do this, we're going to have to lay a bit of groundwork. We're going to have to ask what these connotations were and where it was that they came from. But before we jump into the meat of the matter, I'm just going to provide a very brief summary of Beowulf for the uninitiated, since I know not all of you are Germanicists. This is point 1 on the handout. Typically, we conceive of the poem, certainly it's most relevant to us to do so here, in terms of monster fights, of which there are 3, 2 with ogre-like creatures, Eothena, Grendel and his Moldor, born of the cursed race of Cain, and 1 with a winged wyrm, dragon or serpent, which you can see beautifully illustrated by Tolkien on the slide here. Tolkien argued in a very famous essay of 1936 that the poem was divided into 2 halves, opposed portions different in manner, matter, and length, although equal in thematic weight. In the first, Beowulf is a foreign hero coming from a part of Sweden, Jutland, to help the Danish king Hrothgar stop the ogres from persecuting his people. In the second, after a passage of 50 years, he is the king of the Geats and fighting against the dragon. In addition, almost 700 lines of the poem consist in what Bonjour and others have called digressions, sudden breaks in the narrative into other ancillary stories. These tend to have a more political rather than mythic or monstrous focus. They're quite complicated and there are lots of them, so I won't go through them, but we may refer to a few later, where relevant. It's also worth talking a bit about the critical history of the poem and where what we're doing fits into that. For quite a long period, from 1890 to 1935, critics disdained Beowulf for an apparent lack of structural unity. On your left, you can see W.P. Kerr, who was a famous essayist in his time. He thought the poem guilty of placing irrelevancies in the centre, the monster fights, and serious things on the outer edges, the implication being that the interesting political matter of the digressions was disrupted in easy motion by the interposition of these childish battles with strange creatures. But in the same essay, The Monsters and the Critics in 1936, Tolkien, on your right, vindicated the poem as the product of a mind lofty and thoughtful, and since then, rather than defending the structure, we've tried to find interesting ways in which it's used. That's what I'm doing here. My little note on intent. Beowulf dates from a manuscript from the end of the 10th or the beginning of the 11th century. Bits of it may be older, but what we have is very definitely the product of a Christian author working with a rich Christian literature and a clear Christian formula to explain the hopeless plight of his heathen ancestors, as Robinson has it. So when I talk about the meaning or the significance of symbols throughout, it'll be their significance in a Christian retrospective on a pre-Christian past that I'm interested in. And the same also broadly applies to any Norse comparanda that we look at, as all the manuscripts of the material I'm dealing with here quite significantly post-date the nominal Christianization of Iceland in 10,000. So, into the meat. First, we're going to have to think about what the ring, the treasure ring, as a material item stands for in Beowulf, as I believe it's by relation with the circular ring that the circular dragon gains the particular connotations we're going to discuss. So, what is the ring in Beowulf? A symbol for avarice and cyclical feud, perhaps, but how so? We should start from the uncontroversial position that it's a symbol for the pre-Christian social contract. In the words of Christopher Fee, the act of ring-giving is the primary agent of social cohesion within the comitatus. Thanes are rewarded for loyal service with rings and other valuables, and they, in turn, are expected to serve a good ring-giver, ring being hring or beach in Old English, with valour and selfless devotion. A little substantiation from the poem. Lords and their acts of largesse are often denoted or metonymized by reference to ring-giving. So Hugelac, the king of the Geats before Beowulf, we know often to hringas delan, deal out rings, from a reference at 1970. Finn, the leader of the Frisians in the Finnsburg digression, promises to honour the defeated Danes, not Hrothgar's Danes, different Danes, with hringum at 1091. And Beowulf is periphrastically, by which I mean he could have been referred to as some word for lord, druchten, etc., but it's not just with this phrase. Dhone the him being dative plural pronoun for yertum, hringas yerth, the one that gave rings to them at 3034. And accordingly, negation of ring-giving marks lords not following their proper obligations. Heremod, who is the sort of archetype of the bad lord in Beowulf, ye works to death qualum deni aleodum, grew to the destruction of his subjects, the Danish people, insofar as he nalas bearas geath did not hand out rings. Other poems in the Old English corpus help us here. Maxims 2, a collection of epigrams, proclaims that Kuning shall on herle bear has derlan, a king shall, or must, perhaps better for that verb, in the hall deal out rings. And Norse comparanda show that this was a common obligation in the Germanic tradition at the time. We have a kenning for lord, distributor of rings, bear brutan for Hrothgar, and a roughly cognate, we can discuss exactly how if you want later, cognate for generous lord in a Norse saga, Baubrjots, breaker or distributor of rings. So, the ring stands for this contract. How does this contract stand for anti-Christian violence and greed? What's the easiest way to acquire treasure if you want to hand it out to your followers? To raid, to kill, and to take what you want from your enemies' felled corpses. But we know from the Germanic heroic ethos as it's expressed in Beowulf that this would encourage vengeance. It is better for each that he should avenge his friend than mourn greatly over his death, Beowulf tells Hrothgar when his best thane Ashere dies. But that reciprocation will itself invite further violent reciprocation, and so we have a ceaseless cycle of slaughter initiated, feud or fertho. And an example of this is Hygelac's death-seeking Frisian treasure. Hygelac attacks the Frisians just because he wants treasure, no other reason. This dooms the Jætas to Frisian retribution after Beowulf dies. Beowulf is simply too strong to be defeated by the Frisians before then, but after he dies there is wen orle chwile, expectation of cruel times, and this is why the poem has such an ambiguous conclusion. Even though the dragon dies, cruel retribution will come. And Norse comparanda help us again with the association of rings and cyclic violence. Andvaranaut, in Snorri's account, can increase wealth, yxla the, for whoever holds it, but it's cursed to bring death by those who want the ring for themselves, for whomever has it, and Sigurður dies this way, as do Gunnar and Hogni, the brothers of his wife. Ring seeking, also since it involves looking for treasure, can ensnare the Lord in the second thematic strain we identified, that is avarice or greed for material things. Heremod is a good example of this. We saw how he did not hand out rings, give out bearas, and so in his breast there grows a breosthord blodre, or blood-fierce breasthord. Breasthord is a kenning for inner emotional state or something like that. The hord element literally means a hoard of treasure. So in this nominal compound we have a nominal element that literally denotes obsession with material things to indicate the growing of vice within Heremod's breath. We can compare some Christian precepts from Matthew. Don't heap up treasure for yourselves in the earth. The dragon hoard in Beowulf of treasure of rings is literally in the earth. And all who take up the sword will die by the sword, as Jesus tells Peter. That's cyclical violence in a nutshell. So we can say, the ring stands for a system sustained by two forces in explicit opposition to Christian ideals. What then does this have to do with dragons? Well, we have several depictions from both Norse runestones roughly contemporaneous with our manuscript and with slightly earlier Irish gospel books of Oroboroi. On the right, I think you have quite a clear example of a ring like Ouroboros. That runestone has no name, alas, only a number. The one on the left is Fafnir, because you can see Sigurður stabbing into the body of the serpent from above. The eating is less clear there, but it's certainly circular and ring-like in a similar way. Then here from the Book of Kells, a highly stylized Ouroboros on the left for the crucifixion scene in Matthew. And then in the Book of Durrow, another Irish gospel book, I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting, but at the top you have several heart-like shapes, which are again serpents consuming one another. So, let me ask you this. What is the Ouroboros but a circular, glittering entity, glittering like a ring, which sustains itself by a process that involves constant bloodshed or destruction? It consumes itself and renews itself, it has scales, it glitters like a ring. I would argue, or suggest perhaps better, that this innate and perhaps incidental suitability to the symbolism of the ring as we have established it caused the circular serpent to take on the symbolic characteristics of the ring. And I think this is implicit in Norse comparanda, in Fafnir's transformation into a serpent. He kills his father for a ring, and then Braski Ormsliki transforms into the shape of a serpent. We know that this shape of a serpent is Ouroboros, not merely from the runestone we saw, but also from the etymology of his name, coming from Proto-Germanic favmos, originally embrace, so he encircles and embraces the horde. So we could say that the visual form of that which he lusts for infects and warps his body into a concordant shape, or something like that. Alas, in Beowulf, we don't have any direct descriptions or portrayals of the dragon as circular or ring-like, but there are striking similarities between it and Fafnir otherwise. Both preside over cursed gold, the Rhine gold in Fafnir's case, in Beowulf's case, Iumana gold guldrebe wunden, the gold of ancient men surrounded by a curse. And in both cases, seeking this invites destruction by others who desire the gold. And we know that the poet knew some form of the Sigurðr myth because he recounts a version of it through the mouth of the Shorp, in which Siemund kills the dragon rather than Sigurðr. Davidson suggested that maybe the dragon in Beowulf was therefore the product of a similar metamorphosis, but that's just a suggestion, we can't be sure about that. Nevertheless, these similarities make references to the dragon in Beowulf as curled or curved in some way, bogen ye bogen, circumstantially suggestive. Perhaps this is a circular curvature. And if we want a stronger connection between the thematic concerns we've identified and dragons in the Old English tradition, manuscript D of the Chronicle can help us. Under the year 793, where Lindisfarne is laid low by heathen raiders, there is a portent scene, Furene drakan, fiery dragons, flying in Northumberland, and the reavers perpetrate twinned avarice and violence, Hreaflakan, manslicht, plunder and murder. So, assuming now that we have successfully shown that these connotations are attached to the dragon in Old English tradition, how does this manifest in structural rings in the poem? In two ways. Locally, through parallelisms that foreground the thematic concerns that we've identified, but also in, I suppose you could say, a very loose kind of technopygnia, a sketching of the shadow of the dragon onto circular arrangements in the poem. So, here's one example. Beowulf's combat with Grendel. I don't think we have time, so I won't go through every single point of this ring composition, but the third point in, which I've done with a red line, and the third point from the bottom, or perhaps the fourth here. No, it is the third. I put the arrow in the wrong place. Please forgive me for that. We have between 2 points of what Niles calls brute physical assimilation, where Grendel devours Hansjö, one of the Yeats, and where Beowulf pulls out Grendel's arm, metrical, phrasal, and alliterative parallels. The relevant half-lines are Bart banlokan, bit down the bone locks, and Burston banlokan, the bone locks burst. The alliteration with the voice closest is clear. The phrasal parallel with the banlokan word is also clear. And both of these lines are variants of Sivers' metrical type D1. So we have an identification woven between Grendel and Beowulf. I would suggest that because Beowulf, even though he seems to be acting nobly, is engaging in violence to defend the comitatus of Hrothgar, an instantiation of the social contract that we've discussed, the pre-Christian one, he is likened to a creature that cannot sustain itself by anything but violence because he's defending a system that cannot sustain itself by anything but violence. So that's our first example, emphasizing cyclic violence. Second example does a similar thing, but in a slightly less clear way, and alas, we don't have any clear phraseological parallels here, so certain people in the room might censure this. It's just thematic. We've actually got 2 points of parallel, but I'll start with the one which is illuminated as the second point in and the second point from the bottom. This is the Finnsburg episode. So we're thinking about Hildeburh here, who is the wife of another Danish king, Hnaf. Let's think about the progression of her life in the episode. She begins life unmarried in Denmark, marries Hnaf, is born to Frisia after her husband's death by his murderer Finn, and then ultimately returns to Denmark unmarried again after Hengist avenges him. As Tonsfeld has put it, as the account moves forward, her life in effect moves backward. So we could say that she's found at equivalent positions in this structural ring, emphasizes the cyclic motion of this fruitless cycle, or her return to a conceptually initial position as she experienced it in life. And this being relevant because the feud, as described in the Finnsburg episode, is an instance of cyclic violence, and she herself therefore experiences cyclic consequences in connection with this. And then this instance of cyclic violence is contained within another example of feud, that is 2 references to Hrothel's later treachery, as we read about it in Wheatsith, towards the sons of Hrothgar. The implication is that when these sons die, he's going to try and seize the Danish throne. So one instance of feud mirrors another. So we have cyclicality internal to each of these instances of feud, but also the suggestion that patterns of feud are ineluctable on all levels of the narrative, as it were, in a world that exists without God. And for our third structure, this emphasizing the consumption by greed that we discussed earlier. We can take the entire poem, as Niles has set it out here. Obviously, he doesn't set out every single parallel point that exists, and I think it's one that he hasn't, one that he hasn't given us, which is of interest here. The first and last speech acts of Beowulf the character, introduced by the poet, fit almost perfectly into this scheme. The first after point D at the top there, where Hrothgar orders to build Heorot, and the last within point D at the bottom, but that is within Beowulf's speech, where he orders his barrow to be built. These two instances of the introduction of speech are the only ones in relation to Beowulf in which kennings with the element hord are employed. We've got wordhord here, wordhord meaning eloquence or something like that, and breosthord, which we discussed earlier. Now, we mentioned with the breosthord of Heremod before, how the use of this within the nominal compound that refers to his emotional state, the use of a noun denoting physical treasure, implies infiltration of lust for gold into his emotional state. So we could say that just that kind of infiltration envelops or encircles the entirety of the Wordhord that Beowulf dispenses throughout the poem. In other words, that all that he says, the shadow of greed lies, or avarice lies upon it, in a manner that you can only really appreciate after you've got through the whole thing. And this suits what we know of Beowulf's death. He chooses to fight the dragon alone because he's eager to look upon the hoard and to take the treasure, and also to recall the glory of his earlier days. But in that case, he is engaging in a foolish act solely because he is motivated by material eagerness. So those are my 3 examples. How much time do we have left? 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, so I can provide a brief methodological defense. I don't think I need to provide a general defense of discerning correspondences between visual and structural forms, because I think it's sort of taken as a given that you can do that, given the talks we've had over the past day or so. But what I could offer is an instance of how this sort of thing has been done before with reference to dragons specifically in the sphere of studies of Beowulf. So in 1967, a man called John Layerley wrote a quite famous article arguing that Lacertine, draconic or serpentine patterning in Insular Visual Art, influenced interlace patterning, a sort of AB synchesis type pattern, both of individual words in the poem, but also of broader units, whether those be clauses or entire episodes. As he says, with patience and a steady eye, one can follow a band through the entire knotwork design of the whole, and some examples of the visual form of this interweaving of strands I give here. On your left, you have the Sutton Hoo belt buckle from the early 7th century, which is in the British Museum, and one of the most spectacular works of material aesthetic glory in the entire Anglo-Saxon period. And then you also have the Gandersheim casket from the 8th century. I don't think we'll try to trace the individual Lacertine strands now, because we might get lost and it's probably a bit too small for you, but you can always go to London and do that yourself if you're eager to. And also, we know that Anglo-Latin poets in particular had an especial sensibility to the interplay between visual and structural forms because of their interest in carmina figurata, which Velazar discussed yesterday. So this is an example from a manuscript that I'm working on at the moment for my master's thesis. This is a rota, or a wheel, with 8 lines, each of which have 16 perfect syllables and are divided perfectly in half with 8 syllables on either end of a central O. And the wheel here is taken to be representative of the entirety of creation. That's one of the lines there. Omnibus in membris solvit me crimine diro. He, Christ, releases me from a dire crime in each one of my limbs. So just as you can find exoneration from sin and the grandeur of God's design in all elements of creation, so you can find it in each of the individual limbs of this, I suppose, rather less unholy ring than the types that we've been discussing. And thus, the way that this is arranged, the visual form that you can start from any particular line, is essential to the Christian theme that it advances. Righty-ho, so there it is. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure it could be refined in many ways, so take it all tentatively, but I'd be very eager to hear if you had any suggestions.
Thank you.